He's engineering manager at IMDb, part of Amazon, and also previously worked at Microsoft. Welcome, Eugene. How to pass the behavioral mock interviews at big tech companies like Mang company.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Awesome. Today we're going to be talking about mastering the behavioral interview. And before we start talking about that, what is behavioral interviewing? Probably a lot of you guys already know, but essentially it's the idea of trying to plumb the candidate's previous experience in order to extract the idea of what they will do in similar situations in the future. And over time, I've been in the industry for 28 years now. As Evgeny mentioned, I worked in Microsoft for 15 years, Adobe, Amazon now 2.5 years. I've seen the style of interviewing really shift over this time. It used to be that the kind of questions that were asked during an interview, other than obviously coding and system design type questions, would be things like, how do you approach tight deadlines? How do you prioritize your work? How do you deal with difficult people? And those are all good things to find out. The problem is that when you ask the questions in that way, what it invites is book knowledge. Like, how do you deal with difficult people? Let me tell you about this Crucial Conversations book I read. And reading books is awesome. Absolutely learn from books. But the thing is, in practice, we all know that book knowledge is not the same thing as real knowledge. Like, just knowing what you should do doesn't mean you're actually going to do it. So over time, the way that this has shifted is the questions are now more along the lines of, tell me about a time when you, for example, tell me about a time when you had a tight deadline on a critical project. Tell me about a time when you had several conflicting priorities. What did you do to resolve the situation? Tell me about a time when you had a disagreement with a coworker or your manager. What happened? Right? So the obvious question is, why is that better? The dictum here is past behavior predicts future behavior. That is a very important thing to keep in mind when interviewing. So what you did in the past is very likely what you're going to do in the future. So as a hiring manager, what I want to know is, did you get into this situation? And if so, how did you handle it? The other thing, and I alluded to this earlier about book knowledge versus earned knowledge, tends to have higher, what I call signal amplitude. So by signal amplitude, what I mean is how you're generally asked as the first question, tell me about yourself. And one of the really poor responses is going to be, last year I worked for Acme Corp and I did this. And then the year before I worked for Foo Corp and I did that. And 2 years before that, I was working for Bar Corp and I did this. And you just basically recite the resume. So the problem with an answer like that, as exemplified by signal amplitude, is it's like a rote recitation. As a hiring manager, it tells me almost nothing about you as a person, about what motivates you, about what drives you. It's just a rote recitation. So the signal amplitude of that answer is very low. In the same sense, if you're just retelling me what you've read in a book, the signal amplitude of that answer is very low. And the point is that when I finish my interview, when I go to write up notes, if all I have is a bunch of low signal amplitude answers, I have nothing by which to justify a hire decision. And all of the large companies have a dictum that if you're in doubt, that's a no. So if you come out of an interview and you're not sure whether to hire that person, yeah, might be good enough kind of thing, that's a no. So you have to come out of the interview saying, oh yes, absolutely, I want this person tomorrow. And that only happens when you have high signal amplitude answers. So super important. As I mentioned, like big companies have all switched to behavioral interviewing now. All the companies I've ever interviewed are using that modality. It's the primary interviewing mode at Amazon. Every single interviewer, even the ones that do technical questions, will ask you a behavioral interview question too, at least in the teams that I've seen. I can't speak for all of Amazon because Amazon is pretty large, but that's the basic idea. Let's talk about how do you approach being able to answer questions like that. The key thing here is what I call a story bank. You develop a bank of stories. So usually you're going to want 10 to 15 stories that you know pretty well and that you can recite without undue difficulty trying to remember details, etc. And then when a behavioral interviewing question comes up, you simply reach into your story bank and you recite, like you tell one of those stories. Note, actually, recite is not the right way to think of it. Like you're not memorizing 10 to 15 stories and just mindlessly reciting them, because again, that's going to generate low signal amplitude. You actually want to use your own words, your own passion, like the feelings that happen during the story. So you want to make it interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the other thing to think about is the more senior your role, the larger scope the story should be. For example, if I ask you, tell me about the biggest failure you had tangible business impact. And you tell me, there was this time I broke a build. I'm going to know that you're a very junior candidate, because if the largest mistake you had was that you broke a build once, you clearly haven't had a large scope in your previous roles. So the more senior you are, the bigger the failure in that particular scenario should be. Or if it's a positively slanted question, the bigger the blast radius of the success should be. The other thing is, be ready for follow-up, dig deep questions. So what often happens in an interview like that is they'll ask the initial tell me about type question. You start telling the story and the interviewer starts asking for details. If you are having to reach and remember those details in the middle of the interview, that's going to make your story seem way less authentic. It's going to make it seem like you're inventing. So you need to know the details, and we'll talk a little bit more about what kind of details a little bit later on. And then the last thing to think about is show what I call OKA. This is an acronym that I came up with because you're only successful if you've come up with an acronym. So OKA is my acronym for first, ownership. That's the O. So a story has to show ownership. In other words, like the things you did to make the story successful. You are the primary character in your story. That means that it's all about what you did and how you showed ownership over the problem. Second one is pretty simple. It's competence, right? So that's like the basic table stakes of what you need to do for your job. So you need to show that you know what you're doing. Third one is collaboration. So you need to show how well you can collaborate with others, how well you can work with others. In Microsoft, they actually changed their approach around 2010, 2011, where before it used to be that the only thing you had to show to get a good performance review is what you did that year. And after 2010, 2011, they changed their approach to ask three questions. What did you do that year? Obviously, because that's important. How did you help others? And what did you learn from it? So being able to show those three things, or in terms of collaboration, those last two things in a story is super, super important. And the final thing is attitude. That's the A. So by attitude, what I mean is like in Microsoft, for example, they had this competency called passion for technology. And what that shows up as is working extra hard to because you're super passionate about bringing a particular thing to a close. Or even like when you talk about a particular technologies, like your eyes light up, like your whole demeanor changes because you're actually interested and actually engaged with your field. Another example of attitude can be what you bring to the team. For example, I've had on my teams, I've had folks who maybe were not quite as strong coders, but they were what I would call an enzyme or a multiplier on a team, just by virtue of how they foster collaboration, by virtue of how they foster positive team attitude, team engagement. So they uplift the entire team. And those kind of stories, like when you have stories like that, are super valuable for employers. So the next logical question is, all right, 10 to 15 stories. Where do I get those stories? Like, how do I find them? So first thing and first most obvious place to reach, and this is for folks who have been in roles already, it's performance reviews. For folks who are coming from a college or coming from a bootcamp, it's going to be instructor feedback, it's going to be team feedback, so on. So what you want to do is you want to think about the highlights, like the most interesting parts of your past 2 to 3 years. Any interesting projects, and I'll go through that in a second, but basically any interesting projects, like any particular things that engaged you. And the second one is manager feedback or instructor feedback. So things that managers or instructors point out, things that they find important are the kind of things that wind up resulting in good stories. So think through that. So in terms of what stands out, like the first thing is going to be multi-week projects. So in other words, projects with scope. So it's not like something you just engaged for a day, you got it done, that's it. As a hiring manager, I have heard stories like that. Like I'll ask, hey, tell me about a time when you did whatever. And then the answer is, it took me a couple of days to resolve. I'm like, why are you telling me this? That's great, good job. But 2 days does not really, there's no scope to that. So give me something that's a little bit larger scope. Second one is projects that were initiated based on your ideas or projects that you started. Those are really interesting because they're an opportunity to show ownership. Those stories will tend to highlight your ownership over what you did. So that's really useful. Third one is things going wrong. So projects where something went really wrong. And here it depends on what the question that you were asked was. There are two types of questions or behavioral questions that you can be asked: positively slanted and negatively slanted. What I mean by that is a positively slanted question can be like, tell me about a time when you encountered a unexpected difficulty in your project and were able to work through it. So obviously, like things going wrong is a great example, but only if your project didn't crash and burn. So if your story is going to be, I encountered this difficulty and we totally failed and everything sucked, probably not a great story to tell for a positively slanted question. But if it's a negatively slanted question, like for example, tell me about a time when you failed on a project and what did you learn from it? Then yeah, like things going wrong and project failed. Here's what I learned. And then here's how I applied what I learned. That's a very good answer to that sort of question. So this is actually a common mistake I see with folks that I mentor. They will tell a negatively slanted story in response to a positive question. That's a really bad thing to do. Next thing is multi-team initiatives. So in other words, like situations where you had dependency teams, like either teams depending on you or you were depending on other teams. You had to collaborate across organizational boundaries. Like those stories tend to be super impactful and they tend to have a pretty large blast radius. So those stories are really good to tell. Next one is projects that you play the key role in. That's another ownership type story. So when you were responsible for delivering something as opposed to you were helping somebody else deliver something. So if you have stories like that, when you were the main driver, those are really good stories to tell. Next one is projects that you're just proud of. This one goes to attitude. When you're talking about, and generally it's like human nature, when you're talking about something you're proud of, your eyes light up. Your whole demeanor changes. And those stories are great to show engagement, attitude, like passion for technology, like all that stuff we talked about. So those stories can be really effective as well. Next one is projects with a large scale bottom line impact, right? Here, sometimes like you're not going to have a multi-week story, but it's going to be like, you know what, I had to dig in really hard for a week to deliver like this critical VP level demo. And based on that demo, like our project got greenlit and the team went and spent the next year building it. That's a good story, even though it might not have taken a few weeks or it didn't involve working with other teams. But here's a story that had a large impact on your organization. So those are good to tell too. The other thing to really think about, and we're going to have some fun with this slide, is this story interesting? And to exemplify what I mean, I'm going to use Harry Potter because hopefully everybody knows Harry Potter. I'm going to try to play act a Harry Potter retelling in a way that I hear candidates tell their stories. So there was this guy. I think his parents were dead. I'm not sure. Maybe his parents were dead. Anyway, he had really bad step parents and he had a lot of trouble with those step parents. And then he found out that he's a wizard. And yeah, there was this really bad guy called Voldemort, and Voldemort wanted to kill him for some reason. Yeah. And then Harry, I guess he just fought Voldemort and he won. Yeah, that's it. And then everybody was happy. Hopefully you guys get the idea, like no clear stakes about what's going to happen if Voldemort wins. It's unclear. What's the hook? Like, why should I be interested in this story? The outcome, like what is the concrete outcome? Yes, it's positive, but is it clear? Everybody was happy. What does that mean? So the story has to be, in essence, interesting. And obviously, read Harry Potter to see why it's interesting, but you get the idea. Like it has to be specific. It has to have clear stakes, clear hook, and so on. And a really good way of telling stories in that way is called STAR. So this is a format that Amazon basically asks for and sends as notes to potential candidates to tell their stories in this format. And basically STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. So going through that one by one, situation is basically an example will be, so 6 months ago when I was working in a financial services company, we had a project to implement an audit process for our client. That's it. That's one sentence. It doesn't need unnecessary detail. The thing you can add is this project was critical for our company because if we were not able to deliver it on time, we would lose this client. And this was our client that accounted for 40% of our incoming sales. So you establish stakes. What happens if this project doesn't get delivered? That's really important because basically this is what hooks the listener. Now they want to know, did this project get delivered? Did the company survive? That's interesting. So next one is task. So in this situation would be, I was tasked with doing the overall design and then driving this project with 5 other developers. So this is your personal stakes. In other words, if you don't deliver, if you don't succeed in what you had to do, the project would fail. You're the main driver. So this makes it clear to the interviewer what's at stake in this project for you. Next one is action. So action is going to take up something like 75% of your response, 75 to 80%. And here it's going to be like one really common mistake that I hear is we went and we did this, we went and we did that, we worked with another team. As soon as you say the word we, I have no idea what you did. So my suggestion is throw the word we out of your dictionary entirely. when answering these kind of stories. Like never use the word we. You can say me and this other developer work together to whatever. That's better. But just saying we like completely creates an ambiguous answer. And optimize for specificity. So talk about exactly what you did. Talk about exactly the kind of meetings you got into, et cetera, et cetera. The other interesting thing to note here is that you can actually tell the same story in response to multiple different questions. Because generally, like when you have stories that are multi-week, multi-dependency, et cetera, like they can be used to answer a variety of questions. And what you want to do in those situations is your situation and task are going to be exactly the same, but your action can be a little bit adapted to the question being asked. For example, if the question being asked is, tell me about a time when you up-leveled a coworker, you can tell the same financial audit, whatever, blah, blah story, but focus on, and I was working with Bob, and Bob was a more junior coworker, and et cetera, et cetera. So you're adapting the actions that you took in that story to really stress your work with Bob and maybe de-emphasize some other aspect. For example, if the question had been, tell me about a time when you had an unexpected problem in the middle of a project, you can adapt the story to talk about, and in the middle of working for this audit, like we encountered this issue with this other team and I had to go and drill in and work with them to get it resolved. In the first question, the up-leveling a coworker, you might not even mention this. You are just going to focus on what you did with Bob. In the second question, you're going to really stress the problem that you encountered and how you work to resolve it. And you might not even mention Bob. So you see how you can take the same story and adapt it depending on what question is being asked to really address the question. And then final is result. Result is going to be 2 to 3 sentences tops. And we were able to deliver this project on time. And our client basically renewed the contract for the next 3 years, making us an extra 10 million in subscription fees or whatever it is. So you want to use specific numbers and you want to optimize the result, again, back to the question asked. Or, for example, we delivered this project on time and Bob went on to get promoted the next year or whatever it is. So you see how you can adapt the result to the question as well. So here's the thing. Like I just gave you guys a whole bunch of theory. In other words, book learning, exactly the thing that I said, it's not the same as earned learning. So this seems like simple stuff on its surface, but what I see over and over again when I'm mentoring people, like they really struggle with this. I've even talked to EMs, engineering manager, who came to me for interview practice, and I asked them to tell this like a behavioral story, and it's not awesome. Let's put it that way, not awesome. And they have experiences that they can talk about. They have like plenty of impact. They just don't know how to represent it well. And what I've come to the conclusion on, and this is, I think this goes the same to anything you do and anything you learn, is there is simply no substitute for practice.
That's amazing. That's amazing. All right. We have Joseph. Let me allow him to talk. Hey, Joseph.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Hey, Joseph. Thanks for volunteering.
Oh, sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about your sort of level of experience, just generally, so that I can basically, so I'm going to ask you one of the behavioral interview questions that gets asked at Amazon. And then essentially you'll tell a story and answer to that question. And then I'll give you a little bit of feedback about, what I heard, what could be potentially improved, what you did really well, etc. Does that sound good?
Sure.
So yeah, tell me first just a little bit about your background, your seniority level, just so that I can understand.
Sure. So I have around 3 years experience. I've worked exclusively as a backend engineer using Java, SQL, Git, Linux, Jenkins, worked at a health insurance company, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and then worked at Lockheed Martin.
Cool. Okay. Sounds good. So let's do this one. Can you tell me about a time when you not only met a goal, but considerably exceeded expectations?
Met a goal and considerably exceeded expectations.
Yeah. So you not only met a goal, but you also considerably exceeded expectations.
Sure. So while I was working at Blue Cross Blue Shield, I was given a task where it was basically manipulating data, like an ETL job. It was given to me where I would have about a month to complete it. And I ended up completing it within a week of assignment. I was told that I met all of the expectations, that all the functionality was inputted properly. I did a code review, and then all things came out positive, or the feedback was positive.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit more about the actual assignment? You don't need to go obviously into any corporate IP type details, but just in general terms, and what was the challenge around this assignment and how you addressed that challenge?
And the challenge was working with the existing code base. It was early on in working there, so I was getting used to just working in a corporate environment as a developer. I would say that was the challenge, the task given to me. I had done something similar to it in academia before, which is, I think, the reason why I completed it ahead of schedule.
Okay. Let me give you a little bit of feedback then. So first thing, really minor, but just something for everyone to consider. Remember Oka, ownership. So the O in Oka. When you start the story with I was given a task, that may completely have been true, but it makes you sound passive. So in other words, like you were sitting there bored at your table, and then your manager came and said, "Hey, Joseph, can you do this?" The different way to phrase it, and maybe more effective, is to say, we had a critical thing that we needed to deliver, or the team had a critical thing that it needed to deliver, and I took on ownership of doing that delivery. So it's the passive verb versus an active verb. So you took ownership. You did something. It might not be strictly exactly how it happened. Like your manager might have come to you, but playing devil's advocate, you could have, I guess, said no. So you weren't a passive recipient. Like you could have said, I'm not sure I'm qualified or whatever. Right? So the point is, try to emphasize the agency that you had in taking this task. Make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Second thing, and this is the big thing, is this story is lacking detail. So you need to go into way more detail. And you can tell because generally when you're answering a behavioral story, your answer should take somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay.
You were done with your story in about 45 seconds. So that basically means there's not enough detail on the story. So what you want to do is your situation was great. Like you did a really good job with that. Like you explained the background, you explained what overall the team was doing, drill in a little bit more into what was the assignment, drill in a little bit more into what's the business case around the assignment. Like, why did you have to do this? Like, why were you given, or why did this assignment, why was this assignment critical? Remember how we talked about setting clear stakes and setting a hook? So you want to make sure that the interviewer understands why this was important, because otherwise, like your story doesn't seem to have a lot of impact to it without you telling me what the impact was.
Okay.
I would expand a little bit on the situation and the task, and really talk about, in the situation part, what was the stakes, or what were the stakes, and what was on the line if this didn't get completed. And then in the task is what was at stake for you. So in other words, not just I was given an assignment to do this, but we had to complete it by this date, otherwise blah 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 would happen, and I was on the hook to get it done by this date. You can also go a little bit more into why was it difficult. So you talk about challenge working with existing code base. Great. Although that should be in your initial answer, but go into more detail, because existing code bases can vary. There are some existing code bases that are a nightmare. There are some that are actually pretty good. So talk about what were the problems in the existing code base. That actually gives the opportunity for you to show your chops as a developer. For example, you can say things like they were not using dependency injection at all, and like the stability was complete crap, like it was impossible to unit test anything, etc., right? Like you can talk about that. You can talk about they were breaking fundamental object-oriented programming principles. Like, for example, they had a class foo that was doing A, B, and C, right, at the same time. Or they had 5,000 line classes that were impossible to read through, or whatever it is. Like everything you point to in that answer talks about what you know as a developer, and you want the interviewer to know that.
Yeah.
So I would go into a lot of detail there about challenge of working with the existing code base, exactly what the challenge was. And then obviously what you did to get through that challenge. For example, I set up the environment locally on my machine, and I started debugging through the sunny day scenarios to try to understand exactly the flow of data through the code base. Like that could have been one approach. Or another approach could have been, I went to try to find design docs, and like there weren't any design docs. So as I started debugging through the system, I started creating design docs and like architecture diagrams so that the next person after me could have an easier time working with this code base, things like that. Or like I reached out to the senior team member and asked them for an hour or 2 hour brain dump about what exactly how this code base worked and like where to focus, etc., etc. So there are a lot of approaches that you could have taken to work with an existing code base, but tell me what you actually did. Because remember, past behavior predicts future behavior. So if I happen to have a crappy code base and I'm thinking, oh, Joseph knows how to work with existing code bases, I wonder how he did it. How is he going to do it on mine?
Okay.
Now I know. And the final thing, again, positive feedback, like the everybody was happy result, that's not the result. It's too vague to be interesting or to be meaningful. So what you want to do when you're talking about result is you want to say something like this project was delivered on time and without trailing a bug tail, and we were able to release this to customer X, Y. You don't have to name the exact customers if you can't, right? There's always like corporate IP and all that stuff. But you want to say it was deployed to like our top 5 customers and received very positive feedback from them, or helped us in securing renewal contract from these customers or whatever. So basically connected back to the business sense. The reason that's really important is because this is a level setter. So if you as a developer, like a junior developer, when they just start working in a corporate environment, they're typically very much focused on tech. They're not thinking about like wider business implications. They're not thinking about like how their organization works with other organizations, anything like that. They're just focused on mastering JavaScript or whatever, C++, right? So if your answer is along those lines, like I did this task and people liked it, that means you're a junior developer. The way you're presenting yourself is as a junior developer. And in that situation, even if the interviewer likes your story and winds up giving you a hire, your hire is likely to be at a lower level than what you want. So connect your story back to the business setting in which it had to be done. So connect it back to here is the impact that what I did had on the business. That's a more senior level thinking.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, it does. I appreciate it.
Oh, of course.
I had a question for you, if I'm allowed to ask it.
Of course, go for it.
So just to give a little bit more info around my response. In my career up until now, I've jumped around a bit in my 3 years, about 2.5 at Blue Cross, and then about 9 months at Lockheed Martin. My answer to that was, or to that interview question, stems from not being given opportunities or like a high impact project to work on. I don't know, I guess I just have difficulty. I don't want to embellish those low impact tasks to make it seem as if I'm this grand developer. I don't know. In other words, I guess the 3 years that I have on a resume doesn't necessarily line up with, I don't know, like high impact tasks that you would expect someone with 3 years to have.
So here's the thing. Like I never recommend lying in your responses, like out and out lying, but a degree of spin or degree of embellishment, I think is okay. Because the thing is, what you're doing when you go to an interview is you are a marketer. You're marketing yourself. You're marketing your potential. And marketers spin. That's what they do. They spin whatever they're marketing in the best possible light. So in the same way here, I'm not saying that you change a comma in this text type task and make it a company shattering delivery. But what I do find more often is that even folks who are working on tasks that seem a little bit less glamorous simply don't understand the business impact of what they're doing. And that's why it seems less glamorous. Because really, a company, unless it's a crappy company, and of course there are a lot of crappy companies, I agree, but generally, a company isn't going to pay an engineer to do BS type work that produces no business value. That company will go out of business because they're wasting money. So most of the time, of course there are exceptions to this, but most of the time, and if you've worked several different jobs, chances are you have encountered that most of the time. If a company asks you to do something, there's a reason for it. There is a perceived business value that they're going to get out of what you're doing. And your job as a developer is to understand that business value, because it also makes your decisions that you take while developing that task that much more informed and that much better. It allows you to say things like, I know you wanted me to do X, but understanding the business value, I'm thinking if I actually did Y, it'll bring more value. Now, those developers wind up getting promoted really fast if you do this appropriately. If you simply push back and constantly resist, yeah, it's going to get annoying. But being able to go to your product owner and say, if we did this like slight tweak, I can deliver it like 10 times faster and it'll provide the same amount of value. Or if we did this slight tweak, look at all the customers who are asking for the feature to work in this way. If we did that, you'll get a lot more happy customers. So there are opportunities that you can take as an employee to really increase the value you give to the company by focusing on the business value and not just on the task at hand. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I appreciate your response.
So what I would recommend is even take those non-glamorous tasks and really think about what the business value was and then stress that.
Okay.
Cool. Well, yeah. Thank you. Thank you again for volunteering. I know it's scary to go in front of a group.
Thank you, Joseph. Bring back Hamad.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hamad. Yep, we can hear you. Good. Thanks so much for volunteering.
No problem.
So let's do the same kind of a drill. So tell me a little bit about your background, the role that you're looking for, and I'll try to tailor my question to that.
Yeah, so I'm in a unique situation. I recently got laid off and I worked at General Motors for like almost 2.5 years. That was my first job out of college. And then, did a lot in GM. I moved around across 3 teams over the course of those 2.5 years. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I was a software developer, but now I'm stuck between going into analytics or software development or continuing down that route. But yeah, I just came across this webinar, wanted to learn more
Okay.
about behavioral development from industry leaders in big tech.
Okay, sounds great. Let's do a different one. So can you tell me about a time when you were trying to understand a complex problem on your team and you had to dig into the details to figure it out?
Let me take a few minutes to kind of pull some stories for my 2.5 years.
Of course.
Uh,
And this is, by the way, a very good thing to do. As George, another one of our founders and panelists, like to say, please give me 30 seconds because I like to think before I speak. Take time. That's a good thing.
I'm trying to choose between two, but yeah, I'll go with the first or second team I was on, the second sub team I was on at GM. Sorry, could you repeat the question? My bad.
Sure. So, can you tell me about a time when you were trying to understand a complex problem on your team and you had to dig into the details to figure it out?
Sure. So on my second team at GM, we were doing innovation work related to OnStar vehicle diagnostics. So essentially, it was primarily a Quarkus or backend based app, and it was hosted on Azure. So it was a cloud environment, and the app had a lot of functionality. But the main functionality that I was working on, along with the other team members, was about 10 devs up on the sub team. We were tasked with basically developing the various components of a monthly subscriber email specifically for OnStar subscribers. And that monthly email would detail like a lot of metrics related to their vehicle health or any data service plans that they were enrolled in as subscribers or any type of like warranty plans that they had. So I was tasked with developing one of the components, and specifically I had to convert a logic app on Azure. So like on Azure, we have Azure Functions and like logic apps, which are like low code or no code type of user defined functions developed on the cloud environment. And I was tasked on converting that abstract function into more basically adding it into our code base, which was in Quarkus. This was something pretty new to me. I was a new hire at the team, so I didn't know much about Azure in general. I was still learning a lot. And so I consulted with more of the senior people on the team. I know one dev who I work with a lot taught me a lot about Azure, a lot about the use cases, a lot of like aspects on how to navigate Azure, like the Active Directory and a lot of those things. So I decided to like reach out to him and ask him what steps should I take, or have you done something similar, or what steps should I initially take to solve this problem? And he said basically I would look at the user story and look at the user requirements and what is the end goal of this? What are we trying to achieve here? And specifically my task had to do with like figuring out how to take the first step. And I decided to ask him if he did anything similar. And he said he delved into something similar, but it wasn't exactly related. Like he said, just start with first principles and figure out what a logic app is to begin with and look at every single basically component within that logic app that already exists and try to create pseudocode from it. So that's what I did. And then we had follow-up meetings throughout the sprint to make sure that I continued progressing and not getting stalled. Basically, I ended up successfully completing that component, and we ended up testing it. And eventually, we had our bi-weekly demo where we would present our findings to stakeholders or our innovation work. This team was primarily relating to a lot of innovation work. And yeah, I presented my findings and took it slide by slide, starting from fundamentals, just like he suggested, and try to explain to the rest of the team and stakeholders in the demo meeting, like what logic apps are, my understanding of it, and basically going step by step on how I converted that pseudocode into Quarkus code, which was the code base in Spring Boot. And yeah, a lot of the team members were really receptive. I did make a minor mistake in the sense that while I was demoing, I was testing this component and I showed the OAuth key, which was supposed to be like confidential. So I apologized quickly towards the end, but one of the team members did point it out to me and I was gracious enough to thank him afterwards. But everyone was really receptive to it. Even my skip level manager really loved it. And my manager really loved how I went step by step, starting from first foundations, first fundamentals, and led through my findings and the end result of basically developing this component of the email subscriber, this monthly email for the OnStar subscribers. But yeah,
Okay.
logic apps were something that a lot of the team already knew about. So it wasn't something new. But for me personally, it was new. So I wanted to present my finding or how I understood it just to showcase that here's the steps I took towards understanding this task. But yeah, that's
Okay, sounds good. Let me ask you one quick question. Did this happen earlier on in your career, or was this fairly recent?
this was so I was, as I said in the beginning, I was across three sub teams over my 2.5 years in this position as a software developer at GM. So this was my second team. I think it was about almost a year in, I would say. I don't have
So
a
this
specific, but yeah.
this would be around a year and a half ago. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I have some feedback to think about. Maybe that's worth thinking about for you. Two separate categories. One is delivery, and we don't ask people to come on camera here because we're recording and all that. But generally, so basically, what I have to go on is tone. What I heard was a little bit lower energy than I think might be worthwhile. It's the equivalent of, remember how I was telling the Harry Potter story? Yeah, so there was this guy and he was a wizard and he was fighting this Voldemort guy who was really bad. So it's something you can practice. And I would suggest like practicing in the mirror or recording yourself. That's a good one to just do on your own. But try to, if you look at actors, or if you look at folks who perform in theater, or if you look at public speakers, they project energy. It's in the way that they face the microphone, in the way that they look at the person, obviously we're not on camera here, in their tone, in the passion that they're showing, like all of that. They're projecting energy. And generally, higher energy responses tend to result in higher amplitude answer or higher amplitude perceptions on the side of the interviewer. Because if the interviewer is having to parse through a low energy response, it's just they're not as engaged. And so their notes are not going to be as accurate necessarily or as positive necessarily. So practice delivering with a little bit higher energy. And one way to get there is, again, I'll reiterate being super clear on the stakes. So you mentioned that you guys were working on this monthly subscriber email and that it had to do with vehicle health data and other metrics. But why is that important? Like, why should I let's put it bluntly, why should I care? There are actually a lot of really good reasons for why I should care, because presumably like this email is essential to maintaining your customer, like GM's customer base, to be engaged, to be happy with the products that they're offering. This is a critical part of their business strategy. People are paying for OnStar, I think. So let's keep them engaged. Let's give them data that they really need to understand their vehicle. The business case is very clear. So set the business case. If we are not able to provide, or if we couldn't provide our customers with that essential data, the monthly subscriber email would not be very interesting. Like it wouldn't have any interesting information for the customers and they would get disengaged. The overall satisfaction scores with OnStar could drop as a result, like things like that. So be clear about, hey, this was actually important. Right? This had to be delivered. Second thing is, and this is why I asked you about whether this happened earlier on, and understand too that like the impression that I form is formed based on what you said, not based on what actually happened. So in other words, like what happened might be very different, but just the way I understood it and the way that it's going to make it into my interview notes is going to be like this. So Hamad basically got into an area he didn't know anything about. He consulted the senior folks on the team who basically handheld him through the whole project. And then he wound up delivering the project. And oh, by the way, he also exposed God, I'm blanking on the word, the personal information, PII. He also exposed PII accidentally in a group setting. So first of all, do not mention that mistake at all. Not worth it. That whole made a minor mistake, just omit it from the story entirely. If it's a positive story, if it's a negative story, tell me about a time when you made a mistake. Sure, you can mention that. But if it's a positive story, I wouldn't even mention it. But the other thing is the way that it's presented is that you were basically handheld through the task. So the senior developer told you to do this, you did it. Then he told you to do that, you did that. Then he told you to do that, then you did that. Now that may not have been actually true, but again, I'm just saying that's how it sounded. So in that formulation, this is not a very strong story, because basically as a manager, like I don't want somebody who requires constant handhold. And all I have to know about what your capabilities are what you tell me. So perhaps like the next story that you had, or all the subsequent ones, you did it all yourself. But I don't know that, because the only thing I know is what you just told me. And so you don't want me to leave the interview with the impression that Mohammed basically has to be handheld through tasks. So you can flip this a little bit. Like you can talk about, I consulted the senior dev, he gave me some ideas, and then I went and executed on those ideas. But essentially, if you say following what the dev was saying, if you say things like was tasked with, remember we talked about that in the previous candidate, it makes you sound like you don't have ownership over what you're doing. And remember, ownership is critical. Showing ownership is critical. And then finally, the result. So you want to really talk about, yeah, and actually I just saw a question, are the behavioral interviews applicable for TPMs? Absolutely, 100%. That's actually going to make up the bulk of your interviews, at least in my experience. So anyway, coming back, in the result, a lot of the team members were receptive is not a result, right? Because there is so much ambiguity in that. Like, what does a lot of mean? You could have had 3 team members who said, yeah, it's okay. Does that mean they were receptive? Or you could have had 15 people giving you a standing ovation. I don't know. So be more specific around both a lot of and receptive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I left out a lot of details, but in terms of the consulting part with the senior dev, I wouldn't say I was handheld. I did end up doing it all mostly by myself. In terms
Yeah.
of like meeting, the demo meeting was like 20 people. So it wasn't a lot, I would say.
Well, 20 is decent. It's
Yeah.
not like you presented to a couple guys at lunch, right? I mean, 20 people in a meeting is decent, but I would mention that. And insofar as you're saying that you did this yourself, like a lot of this yourself, talk about those parts. De-emphasize the parts where another dev was telling you what to do. Spend less time on that, basically. You can say, this was completely new to me. I wanted to learn from the team. So I identified a couple of senior folks on the team who could really help me ramp up quicker, so that I didn't have to figure everything out by myself. I went and talked to them. They suggested XYZ. They suggested focus on first principles. They suggest, like, one of them walked me through the Azure implementation that you guys had, the specific components that you had, so that you were able to easier navigate through the Azure portal. And then that's it. And then you say, okay, then I went and I started doing X, I started doing Y, I started doing Z. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah, I could have
So
gone into more on how
yeah,
I did, but
you are the protagonist, not the senior dev. You are the protagonist in the story. So make sure that comes through very clearly. One last thing, really quick.
Yeah.
So what I noticed is you got to the end of the story and then you continue. So you continue talking about it. And it's really important in behavioral interviews, like in a standard behavioral interview, like when you have roughly 1 hour, what winds up happening is the first 10 minutes are going to be spent on tell me about yourself and icebreaker, blah, blah, blah. Then you're going to be asked the question and you're going to respond for somewhere between 5, 10, 15 minutes. And the interviewer is going to ask you questions. So the more time you take on reiterating things you've already said, or on extending your answer with details that are not relevant, the less time the interviewer has to get what they want from the interview. So it's better, make sure that the detail you do need is there, but don't keep going on. Like finish off the story. Worst case, the interviewer will ask a few clarifying questions, but finish off the story and let the interviewer continue the interview.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamad. All right, guys. So the next mock interview we're gonna do the next Saturday, as I just posted in the chat. We'll have there Adil Mansour and Ken Fury. He's a director of product management, and previously he was as an engineering in engineering as well. Adil, he's the director of engineering. So for those who are looking for mock interviews for engineers and for testers, Adil is a guy go to. So yeah, join our next mock interview sessions